Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Insight 2021. I'm Alison Turner. I work in the strategy unit, and I'm also the lead on knowledge mobilisation and evidence analysis for the Midlands Decision Support Network. And the Midlands Decision Support Network, in association with the strategy unit, are hosting this Insight Festival. So it's a series of learning and sharing events for the NHS, local government and other partners across health and care. We started this festival last Monday and it closes tomorrow. It's gone really, really quickly. The theme this year is Insight to Action. So we're bringing together a range of really great speakers to explore how insights from high quality analysis can drive change in health and care systems. All the sessions have been recorded, so if you've missed any, please do take a look at the Midlands Decision Support Network website, and they are all up to date. Even yesterday's session is already up there. So please do take a look. There's some really great sessions if you haven't managed to catch them all live. Today we're looking at exploring misinformation and how we might tackle this significant challenge. So we all know during the pandemic, teams across health and care organisations have had to deal with the circulation of misinformation and then the impacts that's had on different people's behaviours, whether that's in relation to choices about vaccination, different treatment options, or how adherence to public health measures, for example. So we thought it might be valuable to explore this issue, and I'm pleased we have three great speakers lined up today to help us explore this issue in a bit more detail. And I'm just going to forward on the slides. Here we go. So we have Professor Stephen Lewandowski from University of Bristol, Dr. Ruth Carlisle from Health Education England, and we have Trish Lacey from UK Health Security Agency. And they're all going to share their different reflections and experiences of working in the area of addressing misinformation and building health literacy. So I'm really looking forward to this session. I think it's going to be really interesting. Before we get stuck in, I'm just going to run through a few housekeeping reminders. So just a reminder to keep your microphone muted during the session. Because we're recording this, it does help to keep the sound quality high. Please introduce yourselves, say hello, say where you're joining us from today in the chat box. And we'd also encourage you to ask any questions, raise or to share your reflections and share your comments throughout as well. And we will have time at the end for some Q&A, so we will try and get through as many questions as we can. We'll be recording the session today, and that will be on our website very shortly. We'd also encourage you, if you're on social media, to tweet or share your reflections using the hashtag Insight2021, and you've got the tags there, so you're welcome to tag us as well, and we do love to see some of the comments on social media. So I will invite each of our speakers to talk, and then we'll have the QA at the end. So I will hand over now to Steve to kick us off.
Okay, thanks so much. Let me just share my screen, which always takes some time, but I hope you can now see that. Okay, great. Well, thanks for having me. What I want to talk about today is just some studies, some research, but also a lot of work that my team and I have been doing on how to communicate vaccines and other health information in the age of COVID. Now, we all know that COVID has given rise to an infodemic, and which is not entirely surprising because throughout history, pandemics have always given rise to conspiracy theories. In the 14th century, it was anti-Semitic hysteria. In Russia, in the 19th century, it was doctors and nurses that were blamed for a cholera epidemic. Now it's no different. A few months ago, Dutch rioters attacked hospitals and a test station in protest against COVID-19 policies. So having this infodemic and the conspiracy theories that come with it is unsurprising from a psychological point of view. Because whenever people feel scared or threatened or their sense of control is disrupted, then some proportion of the population will resort to conspiracy theories. Not everybody, but some people. There is some data suggesting that up to 10% of the British population think or believe in at least one conspiracy relating to COVID. Now, this is not without consequences. Greater endorsement of COVID-19 conspiracy theories has been linked statistically to less adherence to government guidelines, reduced willingness to take tests, to be tested, or to be vaccinated. And in fact, there's a study forthcoming now that shows that there are long-term consequences of the belief in conspiracy theories, because 6 or 8 months later, those people end up in with worse life indicators, such as even unemployment and illness, than people who do not believe in conspiracy theories. And in the extreme case, belief in conspiracy theories can be associated with endorsement of violence. So it's a non-trivial problem. And you may remember about a year ago or so, early on in the pandemic, 5G installations were attacked throughout the UK because of this nonsensical belief that somehow broadband has something to do with this virus. Now, I did say I was going to mention a lot of stuff my colleagues and I have done in terms of communication. And I just popped the link in the chat as well to the Conspiracy Theory Handbook, which John Cook and I produced coincidentally right before the outbreak of the pandemic. It's available in lots of different languages, and anybody, a practitioner interested in how to deal with conspiracy theories, will find quite a bit of information in there. And in a nutshell, just to summarize, when people suffer a loss of control, some of them resort to conspiracy theories. Pandemics have been doing this for centuries. And what can you do to address this? Well, you can restore, hopefully, people's sense of control. And that by itself is known to reduce the propensity for people to believe in conspiracy theories. Now, misinformation matters even if it is not fully wrapped into conspiracy theory. Sometimes misinformation can be more subtle, not appealing to a conspiracy, but it can still be wrong. And we have data from the United States, again from last year, which showed very cleverly that watching Fox News causes people to reduce their compliance with social distancing. Why? Well, because Fox News, at least initially, downplayed the severity of COVID-19 considerably and politicized the issue. And we now know that being misinformed in that manner is, has an effect on public health. We also know from experimentation that exposing people to misinformation about vaccines can reduce the intention to get vaccinated by a considerable amount. In this particular experiment, it was around 6%. And this was done both in the UK and the US. So it is something we have to worry about. And what can we do with misinformation? Well, there's a number of things we can do, and I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about this. If you want to know more about it, I put another link in the chat. My team and I, actually a very international team, as you can see here, an interdisciplinary team, we published a handbook last year that addresses how misinformation can be tackled. We call it the debunking handbook because it is about debunking of misinformation, which is a non-trivial enterprise because misinformation sticks. What do I mean by that? Well, let me give you one example, entirely arbitrary. Before the previous American presidential election in 2016, there was a claim on the internet that the Pope had endorsed Donald Trump. And that was completely false. And it was fact-checked within, minutes, and the counter narrative was put out that that was just fake news. Now, here's the thing about misinformation. Once you acquire information because you're building a mental model of the world as you're watching the news or as you are in a conversation with someone, anything that you comprehend or that you absorb, that you're listening to, becomes part of a mental model in your head that is representing what you think is happening in reality. Now, if somebody says, a crucial part of this information is wrong, then you have a serious problem, because you got to rip out some, structural component of this edifice you've built in your mind about understanding the world. And what do you have left? Well, nothing, because all of a sudden, a lot of the world no longer makes sense. And that is where we have this ironic situation over and over and over again in laboratory experiments, but also in the real world, which is that people may say, oh, I know that you told me this is false. I know you told me that the Pope did not endorse Donald Trump, and I believe you. But nonetheless, a second later, they may act as if they still rely on that misinformation. So very often we have people who say, oh, I know that's false. And then they turn around and they respond to some other question somewhere else, and they use the information they know to be false. That ironic stickiness of misinformation happens all the time and presents a real problem. Now, the debunking handbook I just told you about has a lot of literature about how to deal with the misinformation. I don't have time to go through all of that. All I want to do now is to tell you that one way in which you can prevent misinformation from sticking is by inoculating people against it. What does that mean? Well, inoculation in a cognitive sense is just like a medical vaccination. What you do is you treat the person ahead of time by warning them that they might be misled. You then expose them to an anticipated misleading argument, and you debunk that argument by showing it to be flawed ahead of time. Now, that requires advanced knowledge of how people might be misinformed, the technique by which they might be misled, but it doesn't mean you have to know ahead of time what exactly they're going to hear. So this is pretty powerful, and one of my students, well, actually two of my students this year, just a few months ago, generated data using a video where we informed people about the way in which they might be misled about the COVID-19 vaccines. So we showed them a video in the experimental condition where they were told that a lot of anti-vaccination rhetoric will invoke emotion. It will recommend to people to do their own research. Somehow, that's preferable to listening to the NHS. And they will perform hasty generalizations, jumping to conclusions based on limited information. So we took 660 UK residents who were unvaccinated at the time. They're kind of hard to find, but they're still out there, and who had neutral attitudes vis-a-vis the vaccine, as we knew from the panel provider. We then treated half the people with our inoculation video, the other half just saw some unrelated video. We then exposed them to synthetic social media messages mocked up in a WhatsApp format, as you can see here. And you don't have to read the whole message. You probably can't because the font is too small. But, we used all the usual tricks of anti-vaccination rhetoric and tried to, in a sense, mislead people using that misleading rhetoric. We then asked our participants to tell us something about these messages that they had just received, these synthetic stimuli that we created for the experiment. So they, first of all, told us if they recognized one of the techniques. They then also told us whether they thought that this was a trustworthy message. And finally, we asked them about their own concern relating to the vaccinations. Well, and what you find is the following. We find that in the inoculation condition, that is the one where we warn people about how they might be misled, they were better able to identify misleading rhetoric about the side effects from vaccines than in a control condition. And their concern about the vaccines in the inoculation condition was reduced significantly vis-a-vis the control condition. So regardless of how we tried to mislead people in the experiment, there were two types of misinformation. The inoculation prevented that from finding traction, and we actually reduced people's concern about the vaccinations despite the exposure to misinformation through our inoculation. And of course, in both conditions, this was all followed by extensive debriefing to make sure that the misinformation did not stick, especially in the control condition where we didn't inoculate people. So that is just one example in which you can inoculate against misinformation. And of course, there's a whole toolbox of other things you can do to debunk it if you can't inoculate people, if you're too late, if they have already been exposed. And that's all outlined in the debunking handbook. And I'll pop that link in the chat a second time for those who arrived recently and missed it the first time. Now, the final thing I'll talk about is yet another handbook that my colleagues and I, again, an international team, cross-disciplinary team from around the world, that we produced early this year, I suppose, less than a year ago. And this handbook is specifically addressed to communicating about the COVID-19 vaccinations, available at that link. And it is talking about debunking inoculation, conspiracy theories, side effects, pretty much, you know, everything that you may encounter in your daily work as people being concerned about. Now, one aspect of this handbook that makes it different from the others is that it is a live document. Well, it's a PDF, so that doesn't change, but it has buttons in the PDF that allow you to go through to an underlying wiki, which we update routinely, not every day, but you know, frequently. And so you will have up-to-date information that you can get at those pages. We have up to 22, we have 22 pages to date. I want to just go through two, just to give you a flavor of what's out there and why it is important to update this. We have one page dedicated to what I call organized denial, or organized disinformation, whatever you want to call it. And that is based on the fact that a lot of the disinformation, especially in the United States, about COVID vaccines, COVID in general, is politically motivated. And there's absolutely no question about it. And, you know, it's no surprise to me, but maybe a surprise to other people, that there are organizational links between COVID so-called skeptics and climate so-called skeptics. They're the same think tanks in the United States that are driving the rhetoric against masks and social distancing, and also vaccinations now, that drive the rhetoric against climate change using exactly the same toolbox. I study science denial, and for me, it's you know, it's been a very kind of illustrative example of how denial works and how it is organized politically. So there's a lot of information about that on our wiki page, and I think that's crucial to understand in some contexts, because you got to understand the motivation of actors in this field. They're not always all acting in good faith. You know, there are some people out there who are pursuing a politically motivated agenda. And, you know, just to show you some data to underscore that, if you compare the votes for populist parties against vaccine hesitancy across European countries, you find this extremely strong relationship. The more people vote for populist party in a country, the more in surveys they're vaccine hesitant. Now, fortunately, that hasn't translated necessarily into vaccine uptake, COVID-19 vaccine uptake, because at least two of the countries here, Italy and France, are now far ahead of the UK, and not far, but considerably ahead of the UK in terms of double shot vaccine uptake, notwithstanding these data. One of the reasons for this is that there are some clever countermeasures you can take against vaccine hesitancy, which I can't explain now, but they're all in the handbook. And the second thing I want to talk about that is a bit more hands-on is how to reach minority communities. And that is very important because at some point, in some communities in the United Kingdom, there appeared to be a lot of COVID-19 vaccine hesitancy. And it was accentuated in minority communities, as you can see from these data here early in 2020. So there was a considerable concern about, the effects of that on public health in those communities and elsewhere. Now, one of the things you can find all this at the wiki page I'm talking about here. One of the solutions to this is to have culturally appropriate messaging now and messengers. And I want to give you a local example from Bristol because I happen to be in Bristol. And the mayor of Bristol created a race equality steering group to deal with the pandemic. And one of their initiatives was to host a webinar on the vaccine earlier this year. This is in February 2021. That was specifically aimed at minority communities in Bristol. It had about 500 attendees and culturally consonant messengers, people from those communities who talked about the need for the vaccine. And just to give you some idea of how this can actually work, here are some data provided to me by the steering group, who did a pre and post event survey. Numerous questions asked of the audience, including one whether, how likely they are to get the vaccine. And as it turns out, there was a boost from pre to post. People went from 74% likely to 86%. So that's a significant boost. And the people who were unsure, correspondingly, that number was reduced. So all the details are online. There are ways, proven ways, in which you can reach specific communities. And as I've pointed out through the links, there's other tools out there with more information about how to communicate under these challenging circumstances. And I think with that, I'll leave it. And I'm happy to take questions now or later. I'm not sure what you had intended, Alison. So over to you.
Thank you so much. I think we'll do Q&A at the end, if that's all right. And I'll hand over now, because that leads us really nicely into some of what you've talked about, leads us really well into Ruth's presentation, where she's going to talk to us a little bit more about health literacy. So Ruth, over to you.
Thank you. And thank you for the introduction in terms of setting the context so clearly in terms of the need to tackle misinformation. I'm Ruth Carlisle from Health Education England, and I'll be looking at health literacy as one of the dimensions, which is particularly timely in what is Internationally Health Literacy Month, and in themes in part with the Insight 2021, but also more generally, some thoughts about a call to action. So I'll be covering the challenge, how it is that we ourselves are doing some work to enable change, but also some of the opportunities and 5 particular tips that we would see at an integrated care system level. So if we're thinking about the challenge itself, so the challenge is in some ways, and I'm not sure whether my slides moved. I don't think it has. Could somebody speak to let me know if the slides moved? It hasn't, right, okay. I think it's moved now, I hope. Lovely, thank you. So in terms of the challenge, in some ways, the pandemic has really given rise to what is actually an underlying issue. And it's not that there aren't authoritative sources of information available. It's actually that people may not trust the sources that exist, or they may not actually be able to assess them. So it's actually a much more fundamental issue than just the issue in relation to whether or not we just provide better quality information for people to use. So thinking about the national challenge at an England-wide level. So if we're thinking about health literacy, so the ability to be able to access, assess, use health information, there are some fundamental underlying skills that you need to have in order to be able to use health information. So first of all, there's a fundamental literacy. Can you read? Or can you use some form of textual interface, even if you're not able to read easily? And we know from the Literacy Trust that actually 1 in 6 adults in England struggle with literacy. So the words were a challenge to begin with. Then in this era, most of our health information is online. And this has become so, particularly with one of the side effects of the pandemic being that many charities, health organisations that have produced health information are no longer able to afford to print materials. And therefore, most of the materials that have historically been print are now just available as PDFs and other forms of digital interfaces for people. So 6 million people struggle in terms of using digital tools. They can't actually switch on a device without help. And again, and this is from the Lloyd's Consumer Digital Index 2020, 9 million people cannot use the internet without help. So we have some fundamental problems for individuals. Then when you talk about health, and this is at a national England level, if it's health information that just involves words, then 43% of adults aged 16 to 65 struggle to understand it. That's 43%, okay? Now, we don't think that actually magically, as soon as you turn 66, your health literacy improves. It just, we don't have data in relation to the over 65s. We then have issues in terms of numbers. So as soon as you add numbers, then actually it's 61% of us as a population, most of us struggle to understand and use that health information. Now, let's just think about that. Most health information that you use on an ongoing basis has not just words, but numbers in it. Numbers of tablets, numbers of times a day you have to do a particular exercise. So most people are struggling with this health information that combines both words and numbers, and therefore are not necessarily able to act on it even when they're well. And at a point of shock of diagnosis, actually everybody's health literacy goes down and you're not able to take on board the information. So that's the challenge from a health literacy perspective. And in terms of knowledge for healthcare, which is the strategic approach for knowledge and library services led by Health Education England, then actually our ambition is to deal with making sure that everybody has the ability to access, assess and use information, but also that patients and the public are part of the team that are able to use the right knowledge and evidence at the right time in the right place, and that they're then able to make high quality decisions. So I'm going to touch briefly on our activity, both in relation to working with citizens and working with the NHS workforce, but I'm also then going to move on to 5 potential steps that people could take at an integrated care system level in terms of action and change. So skills for citizens. Now, we feel that libraries, information systems are ideally placed in terms of supporting people's health literacy skills at a community level. Partly because health literacy depends so much on information literacy though, so the skill, can you find it, but also digital navigation skills. And very often these are skills which are being taught, being shared within public libraries, within other environments. So we are working as Health Education England, through knowledge and library services within the NHS, to support partners in public libraries, which there are nearly 4,000 across England, college and education, pharmacies, third sector organisations, but also prison libraries. And one of the peculiarities of statutory rights is that you don't have a legal right to access a library if you're working based within a community, or if you're in a school. But if you're resident in a prison, you have a legal right to access the library every day. And therefore they are, for us, a key interface with what's often quite an excluded population in terms of being able to improve their health literacy. So working through libraries in different sectors to be able to make sure that citizens are able to develop their skills for better health conversations. And alongside that is equipping the health workforce. So we're thinking about the NHS workforce itself. Health Education England has produced a suite of different tools ranging from face-to-face training through to digital and online and e-learning resources that can be used in a different range of settings. We've also compiled data, and I'll be coming back to some of the data that we've developed later on. And we've also made sure that you're able to work at a strategic level locally to be able to develop services. So our impact, we hope, is that we intend to have better shared decision-making in line with the NICE new shared decision-making guidance, if individuals can understand the information that's being used, that there should be skills for digital engagement with the public and tools for tackling inequalities. So that leads me to the 5 different areas in terms of what we think might be opportunities from an NHS knowledge and library services perspective for integrated care systems and all the organisations working within those integrated care systems in potentially tackling misinformation at a local level. So the first point we'd suggest is actually that you need to get to know your patch. What are the specific issues in relation to your own locality? And as Health Education England, we funded borough level data with the University of Southampton, which is freely available at the healthliteracy.geodata.uk website. Now, the local level data are significant because, as you may recall, I mentioned that 43% of adults struggle if it's words, 61% of adults struggle if it's words and numbers, but there's huge variation locally. So at its best, or its least bad, if you look at South Cambridgeshire, then actually we've got just over 46% of the population struggle if it's words and numbers together. Still not good, but that's the best we get. If you get to Newham, sadly in East London, actually it's nearly 82% of adults who are struggling. And so our geodata help you to be able to see within a locality, actually where are the boroughs where there's most challenge in terms of health literacy. So you can make sure that you're focusing your activity in an area where it's most likely to have an impact and a positive impact for individuals. The next area is actually thinking about the skills of your own team. Now, we were very happy to see within the new NICE shared decision-making guidance that actually the requirement is that teach back and chunk and check, which are 2 core health literacy skills, are included in the training on shared decision-making that's provided to NHS personnel. We have our own free e-learning program, which indeed is linked from the NICE shared decision-making that we developed in partnership with NHS Education for Scotland. So at a basic level, you can use that in terms of a 35-minute e-learning that staff can undertake. But we also have resources that you may wish to work with us in partnership in terms of local opportunities to see about training through. So look at your patch, improve the skills of your team. And then, there's something about information quality. And there's no point in using information that is not high quality, but do you know what the information you're using and is it high quality? So first of all, there's making sure that you don't duplicate whatever already exists. If it is high quality information that some other organization is producing, then actually, how do you find out what exists that's already there? So NHS Knowledge and Library Services can help you to identify what already exists, whether or not it's actually evidence-based, and whether or not it's available in accessible formats. And accessible formats, such as British Sign Language, are important, because of course there's the requirement under the Accessible Information Standard, which is a mandatory requirement, placed on all NHS and NHS funded services, including adult social care, that information should be provided in formats that are accessible to individual recipients. So Knowledge and Library Services can help you to identify what already exists, so you don't duplicate effort by creating another resource in Braille if a resource in Braille already exists, for example. Local NHS knowledge and library services can also help you in terms of finding the evidence to make sure that the evidence is being utilised in a consistent way, so that the evidence that's being used for decision making within local trusts, local organisations, is the same evidence which is actually being used as the base for the patient information. So quality of the information is very important, and there are ways in which you can make sure that actually you're assured across the ICS system that actually high quality information is being used. Also thinking about the system, the process, the mechanisms across the total space, the signposting. Now, finding information on support services hasn't really got any easier in a digital age than it was pre-digital. So back in the 1990s, for example, people were printing out directories, they had their loose leaf files and they added information in. In theory, we ought to have had clearer mechanisms for signposting. Now we're in the 2020s. But we quite often have out-of-date directories that are still online. We have multiple organisations which may be producing directories for social prescribing or for care navigation, covering the same geographic area. So there are, I think, opportunities at an integrated care system level to bring people together to produce single directories accessible to public, but also accessible to service providers, in terms of making sure that people are able to be signposted to appropriate resources. And this could form part of your activity to develop a single coherent ICS-wide strategy for citizen engagement and citizen-facing digital services that's led by and co-designed with citizens, in line with the expectations that are placed in the What Good Looks Like guidance. And then the last of the elements in terms of thinking about an integrated system-wide approach, I think there's partnership. So some of that might be partnership with organisations such as ourselves at Health Education England, and working through in terms of where that might sit with local libraries, NHS and others, but also how it is that you work at an ICS level in terms of collaborative activity. So targeting the areas within the ICS where the health literacy is lowest, working out what you can do in terms of taking an integrated approach in terms of what information is used, what services are signposted to, and then make sure that you're actually optimizing any opportunities. So for example, if there's work across the integrated care system on digital champions, making sure that health literacy or health is included as an example whenever you're improving people's digital skills to help people with their digital literacy at the same time as you're helping them with their health literacy. It also should help to build sustainable partnerships for the longer term rather than just being short-term information campaigns that people may remember but may not act upon in terms of making a difference to their health behaviours and to their ability to be able to assess information. So in summary, in terms of elements at an ICS level, I would suggest that there's something about reviewing the health literacy geodata. So I mentioned that's available at the healthliteracy.geodata.uk website. So you will be able to work out where you might prioritise in a locality. Improving the skills of your team so that the team themselves have the skills, the confidence to have good quality conversations, so supporting shared decision making, but also the confidence in terms of their own health literacy skills for their own health and well-being, as well as for the people that they're working with. That you work with NHS knowledge and library services on the evidence base for the information, so that it is high quality information that you are using within any services that are provided. That you work with local providers in terms of duplication of effort when you're collecting local information, particularly for active signposting, and that you partner with others to build the health literacy and underpinning digital skills of citizens. So those are suggested elements in terms of approach through at an ICS level, taking activity or decisions into actions to make a difference across an integrated care system. So I'm Ruth Carlisle, and you can read more about our activities through the Knowledge for Healthcare strategy and find out more about us. Do make contact if this is of interest to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ruth. There's a lot there, I think, for ICSs to think about in terms of some priorities to take forward. I'm going to hand over now to Trish, who's going to help us think about, I guess, our individual responsibilities and actions we might take. So Trish, over to you.
Lovely, just sharing. So can you see my presentation?
Yep. That's great.
Lovely, thank you very much. Okay, yeah, so hi, I'm Trish Lacey, and I'm the Knowledge and Evidence Specialist for the Midlands region, working at the UK Health Security Agency, formerly PHE. And so my interest in infodemics and fake news, misinformation, disinformation really started some time ago when I was developing a course around why Google may not always be the best place to search for evidence. And that looked at fake websites. And from there, I kind of went on to looking at kind of like fake videos. And then, of course, false news and misinformation really took off, as you can imagine, at the start of the pandemic, where we really saw this explosion. So let's see. Hang on. There we go. So what am I going to cover today? So just very quickly, over the next 15 minutes, I'm going to look at what do we mean by misinformation, fitting infodemics into the health authority process, some tips for fact checking, how and where to fact check, what we can do, and some resources. So I always think it's really helpful to start with some definitions as to what do we mean by these terms. So infodemics is an unprecedented overabundance of information, and this is the key point, both accurate and false, that prevents people from accessing the authoritative and reliable guidance. And I very much see infodemics as the overarching. Infodemics is the wider concept, and your mis and your disinformation and your false and your fake news all kind of fall into that. So misinformation is content that is mistakenly or inadvertently created, and although it's fake, it's not it's not written to deceive. Whereas disinformation is false content that is deliberately created to mislead people, or to motivate or adopt them to a certain viewpoint or agenda. And I'm also very quickly just going to throw in here malinformation, just in case you've heard this concept used as well. So malinformation is information that is based on reality, but it's used to inflict harm on the person, organisation, or the country. So you think about it in terms of your kind of leaks and your hate speech and your harassment. I tend to think of it as like infodemics is the virus and fake news is the disease, a bit like SARS-CoV-2 is the virus and COVID-19 is the disease. And that just kind of helps me kind of put this all into context. So fitting it into the health authority process. So this was highlighted on the Infodemic Managers Training from the World Health Organization. And for me, I found it a helpful visualization on how we can deal with infodemics within the health context. So we can think about it in three main stages. Stage 1 to 2 is about being aware and monitoring the situation. So starting to use social listening to understand the public's concerns, and also listening to and understanding the types of disinformation that is being shared. Stages 3 to 4 is about influencing and monitoring. So we see things like applying interventions, countering this mis and disinformation, and supporting healthy behaviours and resilience to that misinformation. And stage 7 is about strengthening your outbreak preparedness and response. So working on or having a strategy that deals with outbreaks and can deal with future outbreaks. So some tips for fact checking. So what can we do when we see something? So we can hit the pause button. So we could take the information through a checklist, and I have got some checklists coming up, and then make a judgment after carefully considering all the possibilities. You can consider things like your domain names, So websites ending in "lo", such as newslo, often mix accurate and inaccurate information. Similarly, sites that end in .com, .co, or .news are often fake versions of real fake news websites. We can use the metadata if it's available. So metadata are the index terms that describe the items, and those descriptions would be key components in determining, the how, where of where something was captured, and does that actually match up with what is being said? This next one is really a key point for me. Does it use emotional language? Do you feel triggered by it? And this is the one that always stops me now. This is the one that I really kind of pay attention to. When we're being manipulated, it often comes through our guts. So tune into that emotional response. Why do we feel this way? And the chances are, if there's an emotional response, you're being manipulated in some way. So just question that. You could try a Google search with the terms myth, hoax, scam, false, conspiracy, clickbait, or junk. So if you're having a hard time finding information on a particular claim or a news story that you're evaluating, you could try doing a search in Google using the keywords for that story, and then typing these additional terms after it. And this technique might help you to uncover stories that debunk the claims in your article of interest. Always worth remembering that everything in PDF format is originally scholarly research. And finally, you can ask a librarian or expert in the field. I can remember, I think it was back with, it was swine flu, was it 2009? coming across something and being a bit confused by some of the terminology, and just popping my head out the door and going over and talking to the health protection people, and they were able to say, well, actually this means this and this means this. Most experts are always really happy to talk about the work they do, and I've never approached anyone who said they weren't going to help me. So I think that's a point. And also, in terms of librarians, we're very well placed. We deal with information all the time. So if you've got access to a friendly librarian, you could always drop them an email and say, come across this, is this false? What do you think? So tips for fact checking. So this is a couple of infographics that were put together by the International Federation of Library Associations and Institutions, and it's just really short 8 steps you can use to assess something you've come across. So, just very quickly, you've got something, you can just very quickly run these, through your head and think, oh, actually, what is the source? Maybe worth printing this out, keeping it to hand. And this is another version. So this is from the HM government. The first one I won't go into because I know we all will use your trusted sources. So you're using your government sites and your NHS sites. But this next one about the headline, I think is quite a good one. Headlines don't always tell that full story. So it's always worth clicking through and reading the whole article first before you share it. And I think we've all become really good at going, oh, that title sounds so relevant, and then just sharing it without actually going in and then reading the whole thing. Analyze the facts. So if something sounds unbelievable, it very well might be. So if you're not sure, use a fact-checking website and other reliable sources to check. Retouched. So watch out for misleading pictures and videos, and we've all come across these, and it might be worth, something's been edited, so you could do a reverse Google image search, which I'll show you how to do in just a second. And of course, the really obvious one, look out for your spelling mistakes and your typos, and that kind of thing is usually a key element there. So how and where to fact check? So it's always worth checking to see if somebody's already debunked that piece of information. So I use the first 2 sites mainly. There are others. I've listed some others that are really good on there as well. I just want to draw your attention to Retraction Watch. So that's a really good one if you were using an article, just to quickly go onto Retraction Watch to see if that article's been retracted before you start using the information from it. So reverse image search if you wanted to do this. So we've all seen those people have sent you images on WhatsApp and that kind of thing, Twitter, oh, look what so-and-so's up to now, that kind of thing. So if you want to do a reverse image search, if you just go onto Google, you go onto Google Images. From there, within the search box, you'll see the tiny little camera, which I've circled in red. If you click on that, it will bring up the next box. And from there, just go, I saved an image to my C drive and just upload it. So here's one I did earlier. So this here is actually an image that was sent to me at the start of the pandemic over WhatsApp. And I thought, do you know what? Because I deal with this kind of information, I thought, doesn't seem right to me. Saved it, did a reverse image search, and you can see that on the right there is what came up from that search. So very quickly I was able to tell, well, actually, there are some rounds, people are starting to debunk this. And I also then found a UK Defence Journal tweet that stated, that's not an English flag, it's a medical symbol. The British Army actually don't operate those type of vehicles, and it's the wrong side of the road from the UK. So very quickly I was able to say, yeah, that's misinformation. So how to check it. So there are some things you can do for yourself as well if you have doubts about something. So this is another example of something, and this was a letter that was sent to me via WhatsApp at the beginning of the pandemic. And it's a tricky one because it's a real letter, but the contents are dubious. And it's been written from a group that has an agenda. And if you read the letter, you can see that the language uses emotive, it has quite a ranty feel to it, it repeatedly mentions COSH postulates, it says things like, therefore we demand, there's a use of capitals in there. And the opening sentence mentions the VAX and track programs, and I know those to be topics that are popular within conspiracy theories. So from here, I did some quick further research, and I discovered that Stand Up X, who put this letter out, was a social movement originated from a disagreement over the lockdown imposed on the United Kingdom. So I think here it's always worth, and this is the other thing I always tend to do, who's put that out, where's it come from, do they have an alternative agenda, and what biases are they bringing to that? Also then did a bit more further research around COS postulates and COVID, and found that actually this was developed in 1884, and these methods are no longer used for disease, determining disease causation. Finally, if you take a look at the author's credentials, which is at the bottom there, and I know it's very small and you can't read it, but something doesn't feel quite right. It reads almost like a CV where they've pasted absolutely everything down in order to convince you that they're qualified to make these above demands in this letter. You could go one step further and you could actually research each individual author to see if they have any agendas and biases, and also do their qualifications match up, you know, are they in the medical register? Are they who they say they are? So how to fact check. So here, this is another guide, and I've added this in quite quickly because I think it's useful. And again, this came from the infodemic managers training, and it's a good flow chart. But you know, if you had to fact check something for yourself, and if you had to debunk it, so start with identifying the claim or the hoax. You know, you could use social media, social listening, you know, press releases. You know, where did the claim come from? Where is it making its rounds? You can assess the impact. So think about it at this local and a national level. Where is it being shared and who is sharing it? You know, and if it's only being shared small between a few people, you then need to think about, is it worth debunking it and highlighting it? Because will that draw attention to it and make the situation worse? It can be quite a fine line. You also need to confirm that it's actually fact checkable. You know, can it be confirmed? Can it be debunked? Is it fact? Is it opinion? You can also then isolate the fact checkable content. So this is a really good system. So it's a red, green and light. So if you think about the letter in the previous example, you can go through that and you can highlight everything that you can't fact check in red, everything you can in green, everything you're not so sure about in amber. And this is just a really quick way to help you filter information that you then can go on and check from information you can't. When it comes to then debunking, I think you need yourself to be sure that you are free of any biases, personal biases, confirmation biases. Finding the facts. So use a primary source that can, you know, confirm or disprove the claim or hoax. You know, think about the source. How close is the source of the evidence to the phenomenon? Think about the credentials. You know, what do they have to prove their quality? You know, could there be a conflict of interest? And then when you think about the evidence, think about how that evidence was collected. You know, do you know everything about the evidence? You know, and is the evidence complete, or has it been summarized or abridged? You know, is there a track record? Can you go back? Can you see previous versions that you can use to help evaluate that evidence? Then you can go on to correct the record. So you can explain the fact check and given context. You can, the audience should always be given the information that they would need to be able to go and do that fact check for themselves. You know, link to your source material where possible. You could also try the truth sandwich, which is fact, falsehood, fact. So you can state what's true, debunk the conspiracy theory, and state what's true again. So, for example, if you're talking to someone who believes in the 5G coronavirus theory, you could structure your argument as coronavirus is an airborne virus, which means it's passed by sneezing, coughing, or particles, because viruses are not transmitted via radio waves. Coronavirus, which is an airborne virus, can't be carried by 5G. So addressing the myth. So this has already been touched on a little bit, but the first time I saw this, I really kind of had this light bulb moment. You know, if you pull a piece of information out of someone's worldview, it leaves this gap, and you need to fill this gap with something. You know, you need to replace the misinformation, and it needs to be plausible, and you need to explain why it's correct. You know, you can't just say that's fake news or that's incorrect, because it leaves this gap in this person's mental model. You know, so for example, the above reason. So for example, the reason for the warehouse fire was gasoline. And if you retract this core piece of information, say that's not true, it leaves that gap in the mental model. So the best thing you could do is fill that gap with the truth. And so this is where the little match comes in. And then, you know, you say it's not gas cylinders, it's arsons. People are then much happier to update their belief. You know, but what's really interesting here is that obviously the major problem with COVID, particularly at the start of the pandemic, was that we just didn't know. So under this context, you can start to see and understand where the conspiracy theories came in, because they provided people with that missing gap. And what they say didn't have to be the truth. You know, they could come up and talk with some authority. Oh, it came from X, Y, and Z. And as we've also, you know, already seen, you know, having that gap filled in the mental model is comforting to people. So another thing we could do is have a conversation. So this was taken from a presentation by Claire Wardle from First Draft News. She talks about having a conversation. You know, so when your family spreads misinformation, it's very tempting to ignore it or to say you are wrong. You know, but really we need to start talking to each other about this, but we also need to be careful about how we do that. So, you know, Claire talks about your uncle, and I'm going to use uncle, friend, relative, whoever, sharing that piece of misinformation. We've all seen it, we've all come across it, you know, in a WhatsApp group. And you reply, no, actually, you are wrong. And here's a fact-checking article that shows you wrong. What we've actually done there is we've publicly embarrassed that person, because often people share information because their identity is connected to it. And this is in terms of misinformation, not people that are deliberately selling the disinformation, So, rather than the person saying, oh, well, thanks very much for that, they're more likely to kind of double down in their beliefs. So instead, she suggests we try a conversation along the lines of, I saw that you shared that concept in the group. It's so interesting. I've seen a number of other people share this, and I know we're all looking for answers. I'm really worried about some of this information that's being shared to divide us, to divide our family, to divide our communities. And I'm worried about some of these tactics and techniques I'm seeing played out why we all look for answers. And I'd love to talk to you more about this. So what we're doing here is we're using language, rather than going, I'm right and you are wrong, what we're actually doing is we're recognizing, we're using languages and we're recognizing that we, community, families, we're using empathy and we're recognizing that we all have these different belief structures and we're working within those. So what can we do? So I think there are some things we can do as health professionals, information professionals. We can encourage fact checking. So we can encourage users to question what they see, ties back to inoculation. We can increase health literacy. Again, been touched on, and I think we can do this at a local level, much like making every contact count. So, very good idea. So if you were teaching, as Ruth said, about digital literacy, you also add something else in. And if you think back to that making every contact count, so we could start to introduce health literacy when, and fact checking while we're carrying out other services. We can promote the facts rather than debunking. So there is a theory that actually we flood the market with the facts opposed to constantly firefighting and debunking. We can build trust and admit when we don't know. Trust is a real big issue here. People will believe it from who they trust. So I think we need to work on that trust, but we also need to be really honest when we don't know the evidence and say it's emerging or it's coming. Another big one, we can start using less scientific messaging. I'm a firm believer in plain English. But let's start talking about the work we do. We all do brilliant work, but let's remember to use language and explain it in terms of people not in that field understand what we're talking about. As we can see, we can have a conversation with people, start trying that, and I've certainly done that. My techniques have definitely changed from the start of the pandemic to how I deal with mis and disinformation from friends now, and also fill in the gap with alternative explanations that are plausible, but also admit when we don't know. And this all ties into building trust. So I'm just going to finish with two very quick slides. So here is some reputable sources. Certainly not an exhaustive list. Rather than bombard you with what can be a very long list, I always think it's better to start with a few, and these are the ones that I've personally found most useful. So as a first person port of call, always check the UK government pages. The World Health Organization has a page on myth busting, and this is really well laid out and really easy to use, as is the page on full facts. The BBC offers some practical tips. The Ofcom page is good, some really useful links on there. First Draft, go and check these guys out. They produce some brilliant work, usually aimed around journalists, but is very good. And then finally, vaccine hesitancy. I'm not going to go into those. You can have a look through these yourselves. Finally, there's my contact details. Very keen about this subject area. Very passionate. Always happy to talk to people. So I'm leaving at the end of the month, but you can contact me in for a couple of weeks and do so.
Yes, thanks so much, Trish. That was really helpful. So we've heard from our great speakers. It's been really useful actually to really have a sense of a better, deeper understanding of misinformation, disinformation, and the significant implications that which we've seen through the pandemic. So we've heard about some strategies. We've had a huge number of resources shared, which are really helpful. I'm sure people are going to find those very useful to be able to go away and explore more. And I think I've certainly found it helpful to reflect on the role and responsibilities of the health and care services, whether that's at scale, regional, national level, or local level, particularly around how we engage with our local communities. And I think there's a lot there in terms of thinking about what the priorities for action might be. Now we do have a few questions coming in, so I'm going to try. I've been making a note as I've been gone, so I hope I can read my own writing. So there are a few questions. I'll just perhaps take a couple at a time, and then we can perhaps give you a bit of time to think about those. So from Mike Buckley, there were a couple of questions, which is kind of related a little bit, I think, in terms of could conspiracy theorists inoculate against the truth? And then sort of linked to that, I think, is how we might help people who have been exposed to significant amounts of mis or disinformation and now really confused about what to trust, I guess, really. So can I throw those two questions over? I don't know if, Steve, you'd like to start, and perhaps Ruth and Trish can add to that.
Yeah, I mean, the first question about whether my evil twin could turn this around is that, no, I don't think so, because what we're inoculating people against are techniques of, you know, how they might be misled. And that includes things like incoherence, and that, for example, you know, people saying on the one hand, oh, COVID is a hoax, but by the way, it's a Chinese bioweapon. You know, well, if it's a hoax, how can it be a weapon? It doesn't hang together. You can alert people to detect that sort of incoherence, and they then, you know, are protected demonstrably against some misleading rhetoric like that. Now, the thing is, you know, how do you turn that around? When you're incoherent, you're always, you know, you can't be right. So it's not like that we're providing people with tools that somehow might make them resistant to high quality information and not resistant to low quality information, if you know what I mean. There's just no way to you know, if you're misleading people, you have to use these techniques. And if you're accurately informing people, you will not be incoherent, okay? So therefore, I'm not concerned about this being sort of flipped around. But the other question about what do you do once somebody has acquired a conspiracy theory or misinformation? Well, the crucial aspect here, I think, is audience segmentation and understanding who you're talking to. Now, there are some committed people. You saw some of the names. I don't know. I think it was Ruth who had the slide up there. Pierce Corbyn stuck out as a person who signed up to something saying that COVID-19 is a hoax. Now, that type of person you probably cannot convince. However, we do know from research that a lot of the people who articulate a conspiracy or just sort of make a throwaway comment about it being a hoax are doing this as a useful rhetorical device for them to reduce their anxieties or guilt, or you know, just to keep on functioning. And for those people, interventions that correct the conspiracy and you know, the theory, and you say, well, actually it can't be 5G because, you know, we have identified the virus, we know what it looks like. You know, people are susceptible to those corrections, subject to everything I said about misinformation being sticky and so on. But nonetheless, it is actually possible to engage with a large segment of people who seemingly use conspiratorial rhetoric. Now, there is a hardcore you will never reach. I can guarantee you that right now. But not everybody who sounds a little like them is resistant. So there is a window of opportunity there, but it's not perfect.
Thank you. Chris, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, absolutely. Just to agree with that. When I run my fake news training, I've actually got a slide on conspiracy theorists and how to talk to them. So if whoever is interested, drop me an email, I can send it on to you. Absolutely right. Hardcore people, you're really not going to kind of change their minds. It is best to just leave. What's interesting is that I think about the current situation is that we found, like, often reasonably minded people, and actually I know people within this within the health profession that have come to me with things because you're frightened and it is more susceptible and it's so easy. And I did some research around QAnon, and you start to go down those rabbit holes and you can absolutely kind of understand why it's taken hold. But in terms of how to deal with this, I think increasing people's health literacy, increasing information literacy, teaching people how to inoculate, teaching people how to recognize these signs. I think another a good one is maybe to establish how far down this path are they? Are they really hardcore? Are they going to change their minds? Ask them that. If they say no, take them at their word, move on. But if they're not sure, then actually you can maybe start to have the conversation find out what it is, and then do some research yourself, and maybe start to, well, actually, yeah, well, you know, you've said so and so, but do you know that they've also said such and such else? And do you know that, you know, and try to have those kind of conversations. Another good one is to check your comment sections in articles, because quite often if something's been debunked, somebody's already put that on there. I shall stop there.
Thanks, Trish. Ruth?
Just to briefly add through onto that, I think whenever there's something to do with behaviour change, there are always elements to do with the motivation, the opportunity, and the capability. And so that there may be something about thinking about some of these things that Trish has talked about in terms of the emotional elements. They're to do with the motivation. There are some things that are to do with the capability that are actually to do with the health literacy skills, other sorts of assessment skills. So it may be a case of actually breaking it down with any particular interactions in terms of thinking about motivation, opportunity, and the capability. And those, I think, if you take that combination, you're less likely to get the whole, should we say, resurgence back in terms of actually inoculating against the truth as opposed to inoculation for people to have skills. But it is multifaceted. It isn't just a case of saying, actually, this is a trusted source, or this is the way in which you need to go about this.
Great, thank you. Now we've got a couple of comments and questions around the sort of, so Stephen, you were mentioning about the interdisciplinary working and how well that's worked. And I think we've also talked a little bit about the response being needed across multi-agencies. And I think there was a comment in particular about the role of schools, for example, and how the health service might work with schools. And I guess all this is linked to how we might build trustworthiness within our organisations, so that there is that sense of being trusted. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts around how we enable that interdisciplinary and multi-agency working, but also be able to rapidly share what is working in something like a pandemic when time is of the essence.
If I can start with some of that, I think in terms of cross-agency working, to make things work quickly at a local level, quite often you need to have national organisations almost giving you the green light. So we've worked through our professional body for library and knowledge services, so CILIP, the Chartered Institute of Library and Information Professionals, to work then with Libraries Connected, which works with public libraries, and with Arts Council England, which is important because it actually not just funds projects within public libraries, etc., but also within schools, other sort of cultural environments. So that by having a national compact, you can then provide cascaded tools down at a local level to enable people to have better local conversations. So we do have some things which have been very much locally generated. So for example, there is a locally generated toolkit for schools in terms of health literacy and resources, etc. They've been very much about people working together because they've almost been given, I suppose, a permission, a space in which you can make the connections through. So there is a national and a local aspect, I think, with cross-team working. I think there's also something about with any multidisciplinary working, it's actually identifying where the weaknesses of your own profession are, and therefore where others might be able to help. And that can sometimes be quite a tough conversation or self-reflection, but actually that's often where you get the most productive and the most sustainable partnerships, as opposed to just a short-term relationship.
Thank you, Bruce. Steve or Trish, would you like to add anything?
Well, the only thing, I mean, I'm not really in the sort of inter-institutional framework, but what I do want to point out is the important role of trust. It also came up on the chat repeatedly. And of course, trust is absolutely crucial in this. And somebody asked, I think, in the chat whether, you know, what do we do? Can we trust the government to communicate? Well, I don't know. What I do know, and what I want to point out, is that the NHS is very highly, one of the most trusted institutions in the United Kingdom. I don't have the data at my fingertips, but that is pretty well established. So I think that the NHS in particular does have credit in the bank, so to speak, when it is talking to the public. I can almost be certain more credit in the bank than the government, any government, perhaps this government in particular. But so I'm not terribly concerned about the NHS not being able to communicate effectively. I think people do listen. We do know that their local GP is one of the most important drivers of vaccination decisions. People trust their local GP by and large. And that, to my mind, is a critical contact point for successful communication to take place.
Just to jump in on there on the key point of trust, absolutely. I think what we need to do is work within communities. Who is the trusted person, and actually work with them. You know, the message doesn't have to come from the government or from the NHS. Who is listened to, and actually some work around that. And I'd also like to see some sort of like slightly off point here, a call to action. You know, who has done what during this pandemic, and actually, you know, what can we learn from what's already been done? I'd be really interested in that as well.
Thank you. There is a specific question for you, Ruth, which is from Victoria around if you have engaged in conversation with some of the integrated care systems as yet about health literacy, and do you have a sense of where that responsibility sits in which different teams, for example, to enable that engagement?
It's a really good question. I think there are some which have already engaged with us in terms of discussions. It tends to be public health, but it does vary a little in terms of exactly where health literacy sits. And certainly because we've been having discussions about primary care staff and access to health information, and in particular how it is that we make sure that it's supported access to evidence for primary care staff. Some of those discussions through the training hubs have actually led to very productive conversations with the ICS themselves. So it's early days, I think, in many ways, but does tend to be around the public health aspects of teams, and very interested in conversations if people want to have further conversations with us.
Thank you very much. So we are coming to an end. Actually, we've only got 3 more minutes left. There are some comments here, which unfortunately we won't have time to go through them all. There was a question here from Anna. I'm just going to try and see if I can find that. And I just wonder if we can cover that very, very quickly, because Anna's point here is around, you know, we're in complex environments where absolutes aren't useful, and where a conspiracy may contain a kernel of truth. It seems to me that avoiding nuances and complexity can serve to further entrench these ideas. So how do we convey complexity in the face of absolutes on some of the sort of myths or disinformation that's circulating? Who'd like to take that one?
Well, I'm happy to reply to that. Yeah, it's a real problem. I mean, of course. And once if you can get people to listen, then I think it is quite possible to have a conversation about complex issues. The problem is that on social media and the media generally, there isn't the attention span available to do that. And in those situations, I think, you know, you just, whether you like it or not, you just have to condense your messages to simple sound bites. We live in a world where a lot of communication is done by Twitter, sound bites, a lot of it false, misleading, and you just got to find a way to say truthfully something in a brief period of time. And I think that is actually possible. I mean, you can say that the vaccines are safe and effective. You can say, what was it? I think 3.5 billion shots of COVID vaccines have been administered the last year. I think I got that number right. I just looked it up on the wiki a few days ago. You know, that is just an incredible accomplishment. And you can say that, you know, 42% of everybody in the world has had at least one shot of COVID. You know, and wherever there has been vaccination, the incidence of COVID has gone down. Deaths have gone down dramatically, hospitalizations. These are all things that are true and that you can communicate in a soundbite if necessary, notwithstanding the complexity. But of course, if you do have time for a conversation, then you have to acknowledge the complexity and the nuances. But I don't think you're obliged to be nuanced and complex, you know, if you have 5 seconds to talk to somebody. You can't.
Great. Thank you so much. And on that note, I will close down our Q&A now, but I'd just like to say thank you so much to all 3 of you for sharing your reflections, your experiences, and taking the time from your very busy professional lives to come and talk to us. It's been very useful. There's a lot there for thinking about, and also a lot for people to follow up on. So thank you for taking that time. I'll just ask everybody to join in some virtual applause for our fantastic panel today. Thank you so much. And just a reminder that we do have a session still on tomorrow morning. I'm just going to see if I can bring up the screen to remind me what time it is, from 10 till 11. So we have the closing session lessons from the think tank. So that is, you can go ahead and register for that. And also just a reminder that all the session recordings are available on the website. So thank you all for joining us today, and a massive thank you to our panel. That's been so fascinating. Thank you very much.